let's get into diversity and inclusion and how we look at this. And Tyrone mentioned, and I love the phrase about strategy and culture. And that's one of the pieces that we're going to look at in the next half hour or so. But we begin by looking at diversity is in fact a bit of a strategy that leads to a culture. It is not something that simply should live and totally belong in HR or as an HR program by itself. And so while a lot of diversity folks inside an organization live in HR, the essential topic of fairness and diversity really is a part of culture. And so we've been helping people to kind of shift their mindset of, does it live in HR? Is it an HR initiative? And part of that answer is yes, but it really does, to Tyrone's point, need to become part of our culture and who we are as an organization. So we'll touch on that a little bit more as we proceed. So simply having a diversity and inclusion initiative, you know what? It's just not enough. And we see this and we hear this with different organizations that we work with, that it is a philosophy that sits on the wall, or it's written down, or it's a vision, or it's a mission. But how does it come to life to really effectively solve the problems that our organizations are facing, or in fact, our world is facing? So again, thinking about it more than just a policy, more than just a vision, more than just a strategy. How does it become part of the culture of what we do? We oftentimes ask organizations, is it just for you sort of a check the box policy? And naturally, above and beyond it being the right thing to do for many reasons, there are business purposes to look at DE&I, and particularly belonging. As you see on the screen, research shows employees who feel their voice is heard are 4.5 times more likely to perform their best work. Now, what does that mean, their voice being heard? In order for their voice to be heard, they've got to feel like they belong inside of an organization. So this check the box strategy, and some of us have that, and a lot of organizations that we have that sort of approach. They're really trying to move a lot further. And so again, while we talk about it as the right thing to do, there's a business reason to do it as well. And when you look at people's performance inside of an organization, there's a direct and distinct correlation. So I mentioned, excuse me, more than just kind of the right thing to do. What other business reasons would there be to do this? Well, again, there's a lot of research out there, and I'll actually jump to the bottom of the screen here. More innovation, faster problem solving, better engagement, increased revenue and growth. There are business results, really good business results, for having a DE&I and belonging initiative that works and is sustainable inside of our organization. So sometimes we're talking with clients and they'll say, I have a hard time supporting it internally. And I say, well, kind of tell us a little bit more about what do you mean by that? And I've got to show some results and show some measurements. So there's business results and business measurements that are directly associated with this sense of DE&I, these initiatives, as well as belonging. So I just point that out, that we don't lose sight of that. Again, not that doing the right thing isn't enough. It is critical, but understand that there are some good business reasons to do this as well. And so just kind of making that link and connection. So before I get specifically into belonging, I want to do some definitions for us. There's a lot of definitions out there, diversity and inclusion. I want to bring us right to equity, and really in its most simplistic form, talk about what is equity. Equity is the fair and just treatment of all potential and existing members of the organization. So what do we even mean by that? We're talking about clients, we're talking about customers, we're talking about members. It's internal and external. And again, sometimes as we're talking to clients about this initiative, it isn't just internal. We also have to look, how does it represent us externally? So what does it mean if we have a good belonging initiative inside the organization? What's the result externally? Do our customers see it? And I'll share with you a conversation that I had several months back with a customer. There were actually two of them on the phone, and we were talking about their initiative. And I said, how do you feel about diversity and inclusion? Does it resonate right now inside the organization? Yep, absolutely. We feel pretty good about it. I said, well, how about externally? Would customers know that you have this diversity and inclusion initiative? Oh, absolutely. One of them said, yep, absolutely. And the second, they both happened to be white females. The second white female that was on the call, I don't want to use her name. She said, no. She said, we really don't. And I said, well, tell me more. And she said, just take a look at our website. And I said, well, what's on your website? And she said, we don't have a single African American represented on our website. If you look at the pictures of people. And so again, internally, talking about belonging and equity, but what about externally? So important as we think about our organization, what does it say for us inside the organization? And how do we represent ourselves externally to the client as well? So let's get to what do we in fact mean by belonging? What is it? Again, pushing ourselves a little bit further than diversity, equity, and inclusion. Let's get to belonging. Here's what it is. Individuals feel secure. Individuals feel supported. They feel accepted. They feel included. I am part of it, and so are my thoughts and actions and background. That is being a part of a belonging organization, if you will. So a successful culture of belonging, what does that require? And here's where we're going to get some of the specifics of what's behind that and how do I develop that? First and foremost, we've got to have some senior leadership commitment. And I add to that senior leadership commitment that is ongoing. It isn't just the video that introduces our DE&I initiative and one of our head leaders stands up and says, I support this, and then they disappear. That is a not ongoing leadership commitment. There needs to be leadership commitment there and throughout. Ongoing practice of inclusion. Again, the key word here being ongoing isn't just something that we introduced and discussed and put up as a mission or a vision or a statement on our walls within HR, but is it an ongoing practice in everything that we do? Excuse me. The third one, recognition of unique talents. So do we recognize and understand, because of our belonging culture, that we bring unique and different ways of looking at things to the organization? And in fact, do we celebrate that as well? The fourth one there, an environment that fosters respect and ongoing respect. Does the environment foster that, or does it not? Understanding that that is required inside of a culture about belonging. And lastly, on here, openly and authentically sharing of thoughts. So one of the things that we as an organization talk to other clients about is it isn't just the physical representation of diversity and inclusion. It is also around what is up here. Do we engage and appreciate the thought process of someone who is potentially different from us? So not just them as an individual, but what about their thoughts and actions based upon perhaps how they grew up, where they lived, the different situations that we saw in Tyrone's video. Those types of things add to their thoughts. And if we connect to those, the opportunity for us to perform better as an organization internally and externally is exponentially higher. So thinking about pushing yourself as you look at your initiative, are we getting to the point of belonging? Nothing wrong with diversity, nothing wrong with equity, nothing wrong with inclusion, all part of it, but pushing ourselves to say, are we really creating this culture of belonging? So let's break those four down. I went through diversity, equity, and inclusion for you. Excuse me. Now I want to talk a little bit about each one and kind of how this all fits together for us. Under diversity, diversity for us is the opportunity to, in fact, did we I can only see half my screen for some reason, so I'm going to go from my notes here for just a moment. Do we, in fact, get invited to the party? Are we included and invited to the party? That's a kind of a scenario around diversity. Now I'm going to go to the lower left-hand side around inclusion. So let's take that a step further. Inclusion is actually being invited to dance and asked to dance at the party. So I wasn't just invited and brought along. I'm, in fact, asked to participate and included. I'll take that to a third level. On the right-hand side, you see equity. Equity is everyone having their own style of dance, and is that okay? So came to the party, asked to dance. They have their own style of dance. It's might be a little bit different than other people's, and is that okay? Are we accepting of it? Now we go one step further to right in the middle of belonging, and here's what we talk about with belonging. Belonging is, in fact, encouraging everyone to dance to the beat of their own drum. So I came to the party. I was invited to participate and dance in the party and frankly, in my own way and style. And now I'm actually being encouraged to participate and to belong, even though I may dance to my own drum a little bit. So again, just kind of putting that map together of those four areas. We hear them pretty regularly. And what we are seeing and saying is try to push ourselves a little bit further beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion to that true sense of belonging inside of an organization. So, all right, you might say to yourself, okay, Jeff, well, how do we actually make that a part of something that we do, really our strategy, so that it lives on, it becomes part of our culture. It's not just, again, something that hangs in the walls of our HR department and those types of things. What do we do around that? So two core areas, and we strongly believe that it starts with leaders and inclusive leaders, if you will. And so I share a few thoughts around two areas: character and competence, in particular around leadership. So character to influence positively, and competence to influence effectively. So it's both what you do and how you do it. Now, we all know people, excuse me, who have been really successful. And I'll create a visual, and it's probably an inappropriate visual, but you'll get the sense of what I'm talking about here. We've seen people who've been successful but left a bloody trail. In other words, maybe they frustrated people behind them. Maybe they weren't as nice as they could have. Maybe they left sort of a stain upon people because of the way they treated them. So if this is saying, think about not only what you do, but how you do it in the area of character and competence. Okay, moving to the middle of the slide there. Character represents the truth of who you are and what you stand for. So there's a lot of character components that are woven in here to the sense of belonging. But we feel, and our research has indicated, that those inclusive leaders are really looking at both of those. What are the competency pieces that I need? And what's the character traits that I need? So that last piece there from Abraham Lincoln: character is like a tree and reputation like a shadow. The shadow is what we think of it, but the tree is the real thing. So, what is the character of our leaders, and how is that coming through to build and sustain and maintain this sense of belonging in our organization? So, a key piece of that is the leadership character. And again, that goes back to, and actually Tyrone mentioned as well, is having that commitment from leadership. What does that look like? How is that ongoing? So, thinking about those two components of your leaders and their initiative and their involvement in this initiative of belonging. So we'll take that one step further. What about the character traits? Or excuse me, what about the competency traits of those leaders? So some core ones that we identify. One is the building sense of self-awareness. And as we are working with all kinds of folks in DE and I, looking at this sense of what is my self-awareness around diversity and inclusion? Where might my blind spots be that I'm not even aware of? What do I need to be thinking about for myself? Then let's create that and build that awareness in others, that self-awareness of things they say, things they do, with the fact that we are different. We come from different places and different backgrounds. And the analogy that I often use here is that we all wear an invisible backpack, and none of us can see it. None of us can see what's in that backpack. Our backgrounds, our education, our issues, our, some of the weight that we carry. There's a bunch in there, and you don't know what's in there. You have a sense, you know exactly what's in yours, but you may not know what's in everybody else's. So understanding and having a self-awareness connection to what is in my backpack, but know that everybody else wears one too. And one might be a struggle with race, and one might be a struggle with gender, and one might be another issue around socioeconomics and how they grew up. But we all have them. So understand and build upon that sense of self-awareness as a leader within yourself, but certainly within your team as well. The second one there is that we leverage, and I was so glad to hear Tyrone say this, it's leverage and value diversity. Those two go together. Leverage and value it, really embrace it and enjoy it and bring it into the organization. Absolutely. It's not just we recognize it, it's not just that we see it, but we actually leverage it and value it and make it a part of what we do. Some strong words there. And again, I was glad to hear Tyrone talk about both of those also. He also spoke about adapt your communication. You bet. In today's world, between what's going on under the umbrella of DE&I and what's happening from COVID, communication is critical. We see it, we hear it, we get calls regularly from clients that say, I need help in it. Both of those, whether it has to do with the DE&I initiative or it has to do with COVID and people being in all different locations, this adaptation and adapting to communication is critical. Now, that could be how you communicate, what you communicate, the frequency with which you communicate, the tone in which you communicate. Those all mean different things to different people. How often you communicate, who you communicate with, all of those. So thinking about that underneath those competencies of leaders in relationship to belonging. The fourth one is that we create and maintain an inclusive environment. And again, we build it, but we also maintain it. And how do we keep that environment of inclusion and belonging and maintain it? That it's not just something that we, literally, and I'll say it this way, that we open up during Black History Month and Women's History Month. So February and October, we're all about inclusive. No, that's not the way it works. Do we create and maintain a constant culture of belonging, of inclusion in our environment? And then the fifth one here, and this is a tough one for some people, is that we manage difficult conversations. There are going to be a lot of difficult conversations around DE and I. Sometimes it is not a comfortable topic. And part of the reason it's not comfortable is one, we're not necessarily all self-aware of it ourselves. Two, we're not sure where the individual is that we're speaking with is from, or the background or the history that they have. And third, we don't want to be offensive. And so we kind of tiptoe around it. We are saying manage, understand, utilize those difficult conversations. And there may be some conflict because it's a different type of thing. And we are continuing to educate ourselves around people that have different thoughts, different backgrounds than ourselves. So we actually encourage some of those difficult conversations. We'll help you walk through those too. And we talk a lot about that, but it's okay. That's where we build some strength. That's where we build some education in having those difficult conversations that may feel a little awkward, may be a little uncomfortable. Have those, and frankly, have more of those. So again, 4 core competencies for us: self-awareness, leveraging and value diversity, communication, critical piece, create, maintain that inclusive environment, that belonging environment, and then certainly, excuse me, managing those difficult conversations and conflict. That's important. It's important to walk through and sort of live through, if you will, those difficult conversations. And frankly, that's how we learn and grow. So often when we talk about this at AMA, we have clients that say to us, what do I do? Sort of where do I begin with all of this? And the first thing that we talk to them about is, define a goal. What's the future state look like for you? Where do you want to be in a month, 2 months, a year, 6 months? And Tyrone talked about baby steps, and we would agree. You may not be able to just take the whole thing and, hey, here's my huge initiative around DE and I, but instead define your goal. So I'll give you an example. A few months back, had a conversation with a client, and she said, we need a DE&I initiative. And so I, of course, asked her some questions around it, why and what's going on. And I was stunned by her response. She said, Jeff, I just don't want to get sued. And I thought, well, okay, that's a logical response, not what I thought it was going to be, but again, kind of tell me more about what you mean by that. And she said, I'm so afraid of the things we're doing wrong that we may not even know we're doing them wrong, and they could be offensive and we might get ourselves in trouble. I say that as her definition of success was simply, we're not getting sued. Now, that didn't stop there. Believe me, the conversation went further. She said, believe me, I want to do a lot more than that. She said, but that's where we are right now, is there are things going on that we're going to hurt ourselves, and ultimately we're going to hurt our customers. We're going to get ourselves in trouble, type of a thing. So that was, again, kind of a gut-wrenching comment, but I so appreciated her honesty too, for her to know and understand where she is right now, and to simply say, we've got to work on this to stop that and then go much further than that. And she loved the idea of getting to belonging. And she said, I just know we're so far away from that. She said, but I love that phrase and love that term. So again, think about what's the goal, and how do you define what that future state looks like? What stakeholders need to be included? Again, I've mentioned it, Tyrone mentioned it, there are probably others that will talk about leadership's involvement, but who are the key stakeholders? How do you get them involved and keep them involved in this initiative? Thinking through, hey, what's working, what's not working? How do we make adjustments accordingly? What challenges do you anticipate? This could be quite a laundry list, and that's okay. How are we going to address some of those challenges that come up under DE&I, in the sense of really getting to belonging? What's in the way? Right down to the example I illustrated earlier, right down to your website. That in itself could be a challenge that contradicts what you're trying to do under this umbrella of belonging. The fourth one, and we just think it's so critical, is educate, educate, educate. We probably can't say it enough, but educating ourselves, educating our teams, educating our organization, being open to the education of our customers and clients as well. Education, absolutely critical. And I often say on top of that is communication of that education. So really thinking about what do people need to learn and do and understand, skills, behaviors, all education connected to this sense of belonging. What's the time frame for implementation? Just that you're able to put some scale together of what do we want to have by when, and does the organization understand that? The people in the organization understand that? So again, some core components of implementing and starting to really think about this initiative, but adding some time frames to it. And then the last one, and again, I think Tyrone alluded to this as well, is not kind of taking the whole thing at once, but consider a phased approach. And I go back to my earlier illustration where it was we don't want to get sued. That was phase one. Believe me, there was a phase two, a phase three, and a phase four as well. But it was this idea of let me start here. I also say that because we are talking to more and more people who are simply stuck. Where do in the sense of where do I start? How do I establish one of these? What's the first thing I do, and who do I talk to about it? And they themselves sometimes are uncomfortable having the conversation to even figure out where do I begin a DE and I initiative to get to this sense of belonging. So start small. That's okay. Start thinking about what the plan is, what's the goal, what's the initial goal, get some other people involved, understand who the stakeholders are, anticipate some of those challenges, and be ready and prepared to continue to educate as you move through that process. So, with that, I'm going to take a breath. Charlene, we may have some questions that have come up, and I'll actually go to the next one here. And excuse me, I'll kind of take a breath and a drink. And what questions do we have?
Of course, of course. Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm going to add a little commentary real quick. When you mentioned the definition of success, I think that sentence is really eye opening. I wrote it down and I put little stars by it because I think that everyone needs to think about that, right? What is our current definition of success? And if that doesn't if we're not achieving that now, then obviously that's how we have our roadmap for moving forward. So if anyone out there in the audience has any examples or questions or commentary around what is your current definition of success, post it in the chat. We would love to hear from you. I just thought that was a great little aha moment, personally.
Thank you. Thank you.
But
Good.
yeah, thank you, Jeff. But let me get to the good stuff. So we have a question from Brandy.
Yep.
Thank you, Brandy, for joining us. For Jeff, what are the best training methods to build the competencies listed here?
What are the best training methods to build the competencies? Interesting. I'm going to turn that question around a little bit because I actually think it starts with the competencies to identify and define what those are, and then build the training structure under those. So again, thinking about using those five as a beginning list to think about what are those core competencies that connect to belonging in DE and then what are the skills and behaviors underneath those. So is it what I want to focus on, first of all, being more inclusive and looking at conversations that I have. I want to look at unconscious bias and really understand what that is. So level set after you define what those competencies are, and you might have, in this case, we had five. You might not
Mm-hmm.
tackle all five, but choose one or two to say, let's work on those. And again, I throw the idea, the concept of unconscious bias out because a lot of people are talking about, and we start
Mm-hmm.
there. What do those skills and behaviors look like? How do we illustrate and educate our teams on those? So a little bit of I probably kind of threw that at reverse a little bit, but I think about those competencies first, and then accordingly underneath those, what are some of those education points, skills, and behaviors specifically that folks need?
Mm-hmm,
Good
mm-hmm.
question.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. These are kind of coming in quickly. We have from, I believe, Doris. She mentions here, oh, here's some comments. For us, success broadly means that everyone sees their individual role in inclusion and feels empowered to participate. And then from Emily, in the spirit of baby steps, as you mentioned, what is a good percentage target to set as a yearly goal to increase diversity hiring?
A good percentage to, well, great question. And part of that, again, I'll reverse it a little bit, is What is your percentage now? And can you increase that even 10% within the first 6 months, the first year? Now, that might seem like a lot. Again, it's one thing depending upon how big your organization is. So taking a closer look at that, but can you say, hey, by the end of, it's the beginning of February. So by June, so give myself 5 months, I want to be an increase of 7%. But I also go back to what Tyrone said, be careful of the numbers around that. So what does that mean? So if someone is an African American female, am I checking off sort of two people? Like, so be careful of getting into that numbers game. Again, I'm all for bringing in an inclusive group of people as much as you can, but just think through, what does that look like? What are the numbers around it? And I would say, just some conversations I've had fairly recently, 7 to 10%. Can I jump that much within a short period of time? But again, the other piece of that is how big your organization is. So, but very viable question. Yep.
Certainly. Thank you, Jeff. I've got two more here. What groups typically don't feel belongingness at their team or their company?
What groups don't feel? I'll answer that two ways. One is across the board, they don't feel if they're not engaged, if they're not a part of it. So those groups that are not talked to, communicated, educated, doesn't matter if they're female, African American, Latino, you name it. If they're not included in the sense of belonging, they will all feel that way. Secondly, oftentimes the one that's overlooked is the socioeconomic folks. In other words, different socioeconomics than perhaps you have had, because we can't necessarily see it. We can't necessarily identify it. So you may have groups of people with very different backgrounds that look different now because they're 20 years into their career, but you don't know where they grew up. We have to be really careful of knowing that. Here I am, I'm a white middle-aged guy. I grew up with a single mom under the poverty level. People make an assumption that I went to the big XYZ school. You can't do it. So it's a perfect example of us saying, so the socioeconomic one is oftentimes the one that we overlook. We just make assumptions because people are now in their role. Again, you're seeing them at their most educated, their best. What you don't know is the 20, 30, 40, 50 years that came before that. So that's a group that often feels like, did they see me? Am I kind of recognized in this? That was a long answer, Charlene, but hopefully that helps to think of groups that sometimes aren't included.
No, it makes perfect sense. I mean, we have what, five, six generations in the workforce? I feel like I can't really keep track anymore, with the amount of the different groups and whatnot, and it continues to grow. So I think that was a great point. Let's get to something else here. Do you recommend, this was an audience question, do you recommend resources for startup companies to use as they begin to establish an internal diversity task force?
We do. And there's several different things that I would say to think about. One is, and you can approach this from any different way. One is an assessment of where you are around inclusiveness, around diversity, around equity. Just get a sense of where's that, even if it's a startup, even if it's 10 of you, where are the 10 of you? Hey, look at that. We're all white. All right, that's an obvious one. But what else is behind that? So do a little assessment of yourselves to understand where you are. Secondly, again, I would still say define your goal. So even as a startup, where do you want to be in 6 months? What does that look like internally, especially internally for a startup, because that's only going to help you as you try to grow your organization externally. So those would be some things that I would look at, assessments. And then I would look at, I'll go back to my answer earlier, kind of baby steps of small educational components you can do to begin to stretch that 7. Then you create the culture in, or 7, excuse me, the 10 people. I'll use that as an example. You create the culture in those 10 people, and that's only going to continue to resonate as you bring more people in.
Let me get to, we have quite a few coming in. Bobby asks, I see such a strong correlation to strong leadership principles and DE&I best practices. Do you think our leadership development programs also need a refresh in building successful cultures of belonging? Oh, I see you kind of
Yes,
smiling.
yes, yes, and yes. And frankly, it's a great question because that's partly where this came from. Initially, years and years ago, AMA, a lot of our focus was on leadership and management. And somewhere 12 years ago, even a little, I think it was even a little bit more than that, D, E, and I came into that, and it became part of our leadership competency. You got to have, and now there's a big spotlight on it, and understandably so. So, absolutely. In fact, we're having regular conversations of take a step back and look at your leadership competencies. Is anything under there? Is anything in there, excuse me, relative to belonging and DE and I? Absolutely. Yes. Great question. Good connection.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jeff. I believe I'm caught up in the questions. There's two comments here. Arshina mentioned, for me, the definition of success is understanding that different for all of us. There's no right or one definition. It's what you as an individual aspires to and achieving, no matter how big or small. And then Kuchi says, use the data, an increase of representation of certain groups over time. So a few comments from the audience, right? I think everyone's really engaged right now and excited after hearing from Tyrone and then from you, Jeff, and these 5 inclusive leadership competencies and some of the examples. I'm sure we could chat forever, but I do need to say that we're at time. I don't like being the time police, but we do need to get ready for our next panel discussion. I want to tell the group, sure, go to the lounge if you have more questions for Jeff, and you can message Jeff directly. You can also go to the American Management Association virtual booth in our exhibit hall and take a look at the resources. I thought I saw a leadership assessment listed in the booth as well. I was looking yesterday. So go ahead and take the assessment, download it. I think that this is such a good starting point for that conversation. So I really encourage all of you guys to do that. And you're such an engaged group of people. So thank you so. Oh, I have one more. We'll have to send these to you, Jeff.
That's fine. Send them on. No problem. Yep.
Every
No
time I
problem.
refresh, I see something. But
That's okay.
so much, Jeff. I'm gonna have to wave you goodbye so that we can let our next
Absolutely.
panelist come
Thanks all.
in.
Appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Take care. Be safe.
You too.